FileWeaver, flexible file management with automatic dependency tracking. My name is Han Han. I'm a PhD student in University of Paris-Sud. This work has been done with my colleague, Julien, who is a postdoc right now in Aalto University, and finally, my supervisor, Michel Beaudouin-Lafon. So the project started 1 year ago when I had a conversation with my friend who works as a data scientist in France, in Paris. And he told me all sort of tools he used for his work, ranging from the coding environment, for example, Visual Studio Code, to interactive data analysis systems like Jupyter Notebook or RStudio, and eventually for document editing and presentation software like PowerPoint. While having this conversation with him, I do realize one thing is that all those tools are trapped in their application silos. They just don't talk to each other. And that makes it so difficult for the users, in this case, my friend, to manage the information he needs for his work. We start to unpack this question by asking, how do knowledge workers keep track of, maintain, and refine complex information? We interviewed 23 scientists from various domains, and we identified 6 themes. We find that they use different supports for information. They use in paper as a drafting reasoning tools, but they also have very structured nab notebook to keep their research activity and experiment results in a chronological order. They jump back and forth between the information in both physical world and digital world. So what we see here really is the nature of information being distributed among different artifacts. The transfer of information between those artifacts, instead of seeing as a redundant process, we demonstrate that it's also the way it's a cognitive process where scientists review, rethink, and reevaluate their ideas. We also identify participants have this hoard behavior that they hoard information for just in case. And this hoarding behavior adds to the challenge of the future refining. We also find that there's a need to support versions and variants of graphs, both in the physical printouts and the digital folders. To support their future refining, participants develop personalized strategies. For example, they summarize all the good results into the personal album. They also link related information using file names. However, those links can easily be broken because the participant just change the name of the file or move the file to another locations. Participants trying to save all the information in a single place. Although computational notebook combines text, code, and visualization allows in a single format, we find that this is not enough, because knowledge workers always combine those notebooks with other documents such as slides and README files. We also identify this process of produce, communicate, reproduce cycle very repetitive. For example, participants usually using the coding editing environment or a Jupyter Notebook to analyze the data in a form, and then they will save the data in a form of the graph in their folder. And to share with their colleagues, they should embed this figure into some kind of form of written documents. Depends on the audience. And they will send the email to their colleagues. Once you get feedback from the colleagues, it usually requires several changes. The first difficulty they encounter is to go back and find the source file they want to make where they generate the figure from. And once you find the source file, they also need to manage the versions between previous versions and right now the changes they want to make. After they've done that, they need to re-export the images into the folder and re-embed these images into figures into all the written documents. So what we see here is really a manual synchronization process. We're also identifying the limited ways for them to expressing file dependencies. Description, for example, README file trying to describe another file. Dependencies, A lot of files are generated by another files while they have to be kept in sync. But right now, the process is done manually. And also the data file and the script file, they coexist with each other. So now I'm going to hand over to Julien, my colleague, to introduce you FileWeaver and show you how FileWeaver can address some of the issues we identified in the interview studies.
Okay, Evan, thank you. So I'll first start by showing an overview of FileWeaver's three-window interface, which has a folder view, a graph view, and a history view.
FileWeaver tracks dependencies among files and displays them in an interactive graph. Users can view variants of a file as a single file or morph. FileWeaver records the history of each file, which users can navigate and compare versions.
So the point of this presentation is to explain how FileWeaver works, and will not cover all features, but they are described in the paper and other accompanying videos. So we'll see how to add files, how to update files, how to edit files, how to manage file versions and copies, and how to create polymorphic files. So how does FileWeaver work? So let's first see how we add files. So on the left, the user sees a folder view with a file that he would like to add to FileWeaver. On the right are the codebook page and the graph. Both of these are hidden. So when the user adds a file to FileWeaver, the file is moved to a hidden folder called the cookbook page. The user now sees a symbolic link in the folder view pointing to the hidden file instead of the actual file. This is represented by the blue arrow. The hidden file is then put under version control via Git, and also gets hard linked. Finally, a new node representing the file is added to the hidden graph. FileWeaver always checks whether a file is tracked in the graph before anything else. If not, it will automatically add it. So let's talk a bit more about this graph. So each node in the graph corresponds to a file that is tracked by FileWeaver. It has some attributes that are used by FileWeaver and some others that can be modifiable by the user. For example, a node stores the absolute path of the content file, the absolute path of the symbolic link that's in the folder view, some flags. Edges represent dependencies between files. Like nodes, edges have internal attributes and user modifiable attributes. All graph attributes have default values. In some cases, the default attributes depend on the file extension. FileWeaver has a database that stores these default values as recipes. Here we see a default recipe for a Python script. The first field is the recipe, which says how to compile, run a Python file. The second field, trace, says how to minimally run the file so as to generate the same input-outputs as the recipe. Here the trace script is recipe, meaning that it will call whatever is in the recipe field. The interact field shows how the user will interact with the file. In the case of Python scripts, it says which code editor to open. Here it's Atom. Adding files and dependents. So once a node has been added to the graph, we still have to find its edges with other existing nodes. And for this, we need to know the inputs and outputs of the newly added file. So we take the trace recipe that is stored in the node and run it together with strace. This generates a list of all the accesses to files by the trace recipe. This output is then filtered to identify only the meaningful inputs and outputs. Each of these constitute a new edge in the graph. And this is how the graph is kept up to date. The graph may become out of date at any time, so it is important that it is automatically updated. So when a node is updated, the trace is run on that node, as we've seen before. New edges are added and potential old ones removed. If a new edge goes to an unknown file, this file is also added to the graph. The update time attribute of adjacent edges is compared to the file's mtime Unix attribute to see if any dependent node needs to be updated as well. The whole tree of dependents is recursively updated like this. Once the whole graph of dependents is up to date, the actual file contents can be brought up to date. And this is done by running the recipe for each vertex. A topological sort of the graph provides the correct order in which to run the recipes. Updating is done automatically before any action that requires a target to be up to date. Editing files. When editing a file, the interact recipe is run. In this case, interact calls the atom code editor. The user edits the code. When he or she closes the file, FileWeaver asks for a commit message. The changes are then committed to the Git repository in the appropriate hidden cookbook page along with the cookbook message. Then the graph is updated, started with the parents, after that the child is run, and then the interact script is run on the last child of the graph. In this case, it will display the figure output by the script. Viewing file history. To see the history of a file, the user invokes the show history command. This opens the history window. This history window displays information from the Git repository using pre-existing tools such as git2.div to HTML. It provides a simplified Git interface in a way that is well integrated with the rest of the system. Out-of-date files can be easily spotted in the graph view where they are indicated by a red arrow. Consider the following example where a script used to have as output figure1.pdf, but now it only outputs figure3.pdf. This means that the parent of figure1.pdf in the graph is an old version of the script, and this is indicated by the red arrow in the graph. FileWeaver notes this because the parent version attribute of the edge does not match the version attribute of the script node. The red arrow thus signals that the user could, for example, remove the file or verify that the script worked as is intended. Copying files. When the user makes a copy of a file with FileWeaver, FileWeaver creates a new branch in the Git repository associated with the file. We use git work tree to have two different copies, so that the user can work on both versions simultaneously. In the folder view, the user sees the original as well as the copy, identifiable by the suffix VB. This naming scheme is automatic. In the graph view, copies are indicated by a green arrow. In the history view, copies appear clearly as two branches that split off. The two copies advance in parallel. Polymorphic files. When files are morphed, they become a single file. Here, two pictures in different formats have been morphed into a single file with a GIFC extension. In the folder view, instead of seeing 4 files corresponding to 4 different formats, the user now sees a single link to a generic file with extension GEFC. So this is a proof of concept that we implemented for images, and the user can now reference the morph file from any file that is tracked by FileWeaver, for example in a LaTeX script. When a group of files is morphed, they each have a vertex added to the graph. However, a single symbolic link will be visible in the folder. FileWeaver keeps track of which files belong to which morph groups via a dedicated flag. In this example, a LaTeX file references a GIFC file. When FileWeaver runs a file that references a morph, it uses the edge information in the graph to find the right member of the morph group. FileWeaver then redirects the symbolic link to point to the right target. If there is no such edge, the file was never before linked to any member of the morph group, so FileWeaver looks at the default preferences for that file type in the default recipes that I've shown before. So to conclude, we created FileWeaver based on our observational study of 23 scientists managing complex data. FileWeaver shows relationship between files and file history in an interactive free-window system. It automatically tracks dependencies and keeps them up to date, and introduces the new concept of polymorphic files. So what's next? So we want to conduct a structured observation of users of FileWeaver in real context to understand how they manage with dependencies. We want to develop collaborative aspects of FileWeaver, building on Git's capabilities. We also plan on supporting zip files such as Microsoft Office documents. And finally, we also plan on investigating the content and the frequencies of potential autosaves and commits. Thank you for your attention.